May 1945. A town in the American occupation zone of Germany. The war in Europe has ended. Wehrmacht forces have surrendered. Nazi Germany has collapsed. And now American troops are moving into German towns as occupation forces. Among them, black soldiers. Thousands of them. Combat veterans, engineers, military police, administrators. The German civilians know they're coming. They've been told what to expect. 12 years of Nazi propaganda have prepared them. The regime has spent over a decade telling Germans that black people are subhuman, dangerous, savage, criminals who will rape, murder, and destroy everything they touch. Nazi propaganda films showed black soldiers as monsters. Posters depicted them as apes. Radio broadcasts warned that black occupation would mean the end of German civilization. So when black American soldiers arrive in German towns in spring and summer 1945, German civilians are terrified. They've been taught to expect violence, revenge, brutality. They hide in basements, lock their doors. Some flee into the countryside. And then something happens that Nazi propaganda never prepared them for. The black soldiers don't attack, don't burn, don't rape, don't murder. Instead, they start rebuilding, repairing roads, restoring water systems, distributing food to starving civilians, setting up medical clinics, helping Germans clear rubble from bombed buildings. The propaganda said savages. The reality was soldiers who treated defeated enemies with more humanity than those enemies had shown to anyone. Subscribe to see how black soldiers rebuilt German towns when they could have sought revenge. This is Occupation, 1945. And it starts with understanding exactly what Germans had been taught to believe about the soldiers who were coming. To understand what happened when black soldiers occupied Germany, you need to understand what Germans had been taught for 12 years. When the Nazis took power in 1933, racial ideology wasn't just policy. It was the foundation of everything. The regime's worldview divided humanity into hierarchies. Aryans at the top. Everyone else ranked below. And at the very bottom, black people. Nazi racial theory taught that black people were subhuman, closer to animals than humans, incapable of civilization, dangerous, criminal by nature. This wasn't whispered racism. This was official state doctrine, taught in schools, proclaimed in speeches, reinforced constantly. The roots went back to the 1920s. After World War I, French occupation forces in the Rhineland included soldiers from French colonies in Africa. The Nazis seized on this, creating propaganda about the Black Horror on the Rhine, claiming that black soldiers were assaulting German women and degrading German civilization. The propaganda was largely fabricated, but it served Nazi purposes perfectly. It gave them a racialized enemy to rally against, a supposed threat to German purity, and a way to connect racial ideology to recent German experience. When the Nazis came to power, they institutionalized this hatred. Children born to German mothers and black fathers, called Rhineland bastards, were forcibly sterilized. The regime wanted to eliminate any trace of black presence in Germany. Nazi propaganda films depicted black people as savages. School textbooks taught racial hierarchy as science. Children learned that black people had smaller brains, lower intelligence, criminal tendencies. They were taught this wasn't prejudice. It was biological fact. An entire generation grew up believing these lies. By 1945, young adults who'd been children when Nazis took power had spent their entire conscious lives immersed in this propaganda. The propaganda intensified as war approached. As conflict with America became likely, Nazi media emphasized the racial composition of American forces. They warned Germans that America would use black soldiers against them. These soldiers, the propaganda claimed, would be even more brutal because of their supposed savage nature. Posters showed black soldiers as monstrous figures threatening German women and children. Radio broadcasts described what would happen if Germany lost. Black occupation forces would destroy German civilization. By 1945, after 12 years of this propaganda, German civilians genuinely believed black soldiers were dangerous. When they learned black troops would be among the occupation forces, many Germans were convinced their lives were in danger. Reports from German civilians to American military government officials expressed panic. Some Germans begged to be placed in British or French zones rather than American zones with black troops. Some wrote petitions requesting that only white American soldiers occupy their towns. Women were particularly frightened. Nazi propaganda had emphasized sexual violence as a threat from black soldiers. German women had been told repeatedly that black men were sexually dangerous, that occupation by black troops would mean mass rape. The American military knew about these fears. Intelligence reports documented German civilian anxiety. American commanders received complaints and requests from German officials asking for areas to be occupied by white troops only. But the American military needed occupation forces, and that meant using all available soldiers, including black troops. By May 1945, there were tens of thousands of black soldiers in Europe. Many were combat veterans. Others were in support roles: engineers, quartermasters, military police. All were now needed for occupation duty. So black soldiers moved into German towns, and Germans watched, terrified, waiting for the violence they'd been promised. What happened next would take years to fully unfold, but the first encounters set the pattern. Spring and summer 1945. Black soldiers arrive in German towns across the American occupation zone. The initial encounters follow a pattern. Soldiers enter town. German civilians hide. Doors locked. Windows shuttered. Streets empty. The fear is palpable. 12 years of propaganda have convinced Germans that black soldiers are coming to destroy them. Then the soldiers start working, not attacking, working, setting up command posts, establishing security, beginning the enormous task of military occupation. The first hours and days are tense. Soldiers move through empty streets, establishing positions, securing buildings. Germans watch from behind curtains, terrified. One account from a black soldier in the 92nd Infantry Division describes entering a small Bavarian town in May 1945. The streets were deserted, every building shuttered. They set up headquarters in a town square building. Hours passed. No civilians appeared. Finally, an elderly German woman emerged from a house, clearly terrified, carrying a white cloth. She approached the American command post, expecting the worst. The black soldiers gave her food, told her through a translator that civilians weren't in danger, sent her back to tell others it was safe. Within hours, German civilians started emerging, still frightened, still suspicious. But the promised violence hadn't materialized. Black soldiers were setting up field kitchens, distributing food, establishing medical aid stations. The contradiction between propaganda and reality was immediate and stark. Germans had been told savages were coming. Instead, disciplined soldiers were helping them survive. This played out across hundreds of towns. The pattern was consistent. Initial terror, gradual realization that the propaganda was false, tentative interaction, growing trust. The first practical needs were basic. Water systems in many towns had been damaged or destroyed. Black engineer units worked to restore running water. Germans who'd been hauling water from rivers suddenly had working taps again, repaired by the soldiers they'd been taught to fear. Food distribution was crucial. Germany was starving in summer 1945. The Nazi regime had collapsed, taking distribution systems with it. American occupation forces, including black units, distributed rations to German civilians. Black soldiers found themselves in a strange position. They were occupying the nation of people who'd created the racial ideology that America used to justify segregating them. German racism was the most extreme version of the racism black soldiers faced at home. Yet here they were, required to treat Germans humanely, following rules of occupation that guaranteed civilian safety. Some black soldiers found this ironic. They'd fought across Europe, facing discrimination from their own army, to defeat a regime that believed they were subhuman. Now they were helping that regime's civilians survive. But they did the job, not because Germans deserved help, because it was the right thing to do, because they were soldiers, and soldiers follow orders, because proving their humanity meant acting humanely even toward people who'd been taught to hate them. The work began immediately. Infrastructure repair became a priority. Roads damaged by retreating Wehrmacht forces needed fixing. Water systems destroyed by bombing needed restoration. Electrical grids needed reconstruction. Black engineer units were particularly involved. The same units that had built roads under fire during combat now rebuilt German infrastructure. They repaired bridges that had been destroyed, cleared rubble from bombed streets, restored utilities that made civilian life possible. German civilians watched black soldiers doing construction work with skill and efficiency. This contradicted another Nazi lie, that black people were incapable of technical work. Yet here were black engineers rebuilding German infrastructure better than German crews had maintained it. Medical care was another revelation. Black medics and doctors treated German civilians in American-run clinics. Germans who'd been taught that black people were less intelligent watched black doctors diagnose conditions and perform procedures with obvious competence. One account from a German civilian in Frankfurt describes taking her sick child to an American medical station. A black doctor examined the child, diagnosed pneumonia, administered penicillin, and saved the child's life. She later wrote that this experience shattered everything she'd been taught about race. Food distribution showed Americans' material superiority in ways Germans couldn't ignore. The sheer abundance of American supplies, canned goods, flour, sugar, coffee, chocolate, exceeded what most Germans had seen in years. And black soldiers distributing these supplies operated with efficiency and fairness. Children were particularly quick to abandon prejudice. German children, initially frightened, soon approached American soldiers looking for candy or food. Black soldiers, like white soldiers, gave children treats. American chocolate and chewing gum became currency of goodwill. Within weeks, German children who'd been taught to fear black people were playing with black soldiers, completely comfortable. Parents watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Some remained convinced the propaganda was true despite evidence. Others began questioning what they'd been taught. Not every German changed their mind immediately. Some remained convinced that black soldiers were dangerous despite all evidence. Some refused to accept food from black soldiers, preferring to go hungry. Some complained to American commanders about having to interact with black troops. But these were increasingly the minority. The majority of Germans in American zones occupied by black troops began to recognize the propaganda as lies when confronted with actual black soldiers behaving professionally and humanely. By summer 1945, black soldiers across the American occupation zone were deeply involved in reconstruction work. The scope was massive. Germany's infrastructure had been devastated by years of Allied bombing and ground combat. Black engineer battalions took leading roles in this reconstruction. The 92nd Infantry Division, which had fought through Italy, was now assigned occupation duties. Their engineer battalions, the 317th, 366th, and 370th, worked on reconstruction projects that rebuilt entire regions. These weren't small projects. Engineers rebuilt bridges over major rivers, some spanning hundreds of feet, restored rail connections that connected isolated towns to supply networks, repaired roads that enabled food distribution, fixed water treatment plants that made drinking water safe, restored electrical generation that powered homes and hospitals. German civilians worked alongside black soldiers on many projects. This created daily interaction that further undermined propaganda. Germans who worked with black engineers saw their technical competence, work ethic, and skill. One reconstruction project shows the scale. A bridge over the main river near Würzburg had been destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces. The 317th Engineer Battalion was assigned to rebuild it. German engineers estimated the project would take 3 months. The 317th completed it in 6 weeks. German civilians watched black engineers use heavy equipment they'd never seen before, coordinate complex construction with precision, and complete a project faster than German professionals thought possible. The bridge was stronger than the original. Beyond physical reconstruction, black soldiers participated in establishing civil order. Military police units patrolled towns, ensuring security. Black MPs enforced curfews, prevented looting, maintained public safety. German police, under American supervision, worked with black MPs. This created another contradiction: German police taking orders from black soldiers. For Germans raised under Nazi ideology, where racial hierarchy was fundamental, this was supposed to be humiliating. For many, it just became daily reality that gradually became normal. Recreation and entertainment also played a role. American forces organized events for both soldiers and civilians: concerts, sporting events, movie screenings. Black soldiers participated in these events, performing music, playing sports, interacting with German civilians in non-work contexts. One particularly striking example: black soldiers in some occupation zones organized jazz concerts. Jazz, which Nazis had banned as degenerate black music, was performed by black soldiers for German audiences. Germans who'd been taught jazz was primitive discovered it was sophisticated, complex, and beautiful. By 1946, German attitudes toward black soldiers evolved significantly. Surveys conducted by American military intelligence in 1946 and 1947 showed marked changes in German civilian opinions. Germans in areas with black occupation troops reported feeling safe, with many expressing surprise that their initial fears had been unfounded. One survey from Bavaria, where the 92nd Infantry Division had significant presence, showed that 70% of German civilians interviewed said black soldiers were as good or better than white American soldiers in conduct and professionalism. When asked what changed their minds, Germans cited professional conduct by black soldiers, willingness to help civilians, fair treatment in civil affairs, and competence in reconstruction work. Some Germans were explicit about the contradiction. Interview transcripts include statements like, "We were told they would be dangerous, but they have been kinder than we deserved." The impact on German children was particularly significant. A generation grew up with black American soldiers as normal parts of daily life. Children who played with black soldiers, received treats from them, and saw them helping their families developed attitudes very different from their parents' pre-war beliefs. By 1948, when occupation began transitioning and many black units rotated home, the impact was clear. German civilians in American zones had experienced 3 years of black soldiers proving themselves professional, competent, and humane. The experience hadn't eliminated racism. That would take generations. But it had thoroughly discredited specific Nazi propaganda. Germans who'd been taught that black people were dangerous savages had daily evidence that this was false. For black soldiers, the experience was complex and often frustrating. They'd occupied and helped rebuild the nation that created the racial ideology justifying segregation in America. They'd proven themselves humane and professional to former enemies. And then most returned to an America that still treated them as second-class citizens. They came home to segregated buses and restaurants, to housing discrimination and employment barriers. The irony was bitter and not lost on returning soldiers. German civilians learned that black soldiers weren't what Nazi propaganda claimed. But black soldiers returned home to an America that maintained many of the same assumptions. The occupation of Germany by black American soldiers proved something important. Propaganda based on lies collapses when confronted with reality. Germans taught for 12 years that black people were savages, learned otherwise through 3 years of daily interaction. Black soldiers didn't argue with Germans about their worth. They showed it. Through professional conduct, competent work, humane treatment of civilians, and choosing rebuilding over revenge. The story teaches enduring lessons. Propaganda is brittle. It works when it's not tested, but crumbles when reality contradicts it. Humanity is proven through action. Choosing mercy over vengeance demonstrates strength, not weakness. The black soldiers who occupied Germany deserve recognition not just for military service, but for moral courage. They showed humanity to people who'd been taught to hate them. They rebuilt towns for civilians whose regime had declared them inferior. They proved through action that racist propaganda was lies. And they did this knowing they'd return to an America that maintained many of the same prejudices. They served with dignity anyway. They acted humanely anyway. Because proving your humanity shouldn't depend on whether others recognize it. You prove it through how you act, especially toward those who've wronged you. Nazi propaganda said savages were coming. Black soldiers arrived and rebuilt German towns. They treated civilians with more humanity than those civilians' regime had shown to anyone. The occupation showed what happens when people trained to hate someone actually meet them. The lies collapse. Propaganda falls apart. Humanity emerges. Black occupation troops rebuilt German towns when they could have sought revenge. They proved their humanity to people who'd been taught to deny it. They showed that responding to hatred with dignity reveals character more than any propaganda ever could.